He was the mohawked assassin who turned knockouts into primetime entertainment. Chuck Liddell wasn't just a UFC fighter. He was the UFC during its rise to global fame. With ice in his veins and cinder blocks for fists, he ruled the light heavyweight division with terrifying calm, flattening legends and packing arenas like a rock star. But in combat sports, legends don't always get fairy tale endings. Chuck couldn't walk away. He stayed too long. And now, at 54 years old, his life has become a quiet tragedy. His speech is slow. His body is visibly broken. And the vibrant warrior fans once cheered for now shuffles through public appearances as a shadow of what he once was. He gave everything to the sport, and it left him behind. This is the heartbreaking downfall of Chuck Liddell, how fame turned to silence, how victories turned to violent defeats, and how a hero of the Octagon became a living reminder of why some fighters never truly retire until the damage forces them to. Long before he was headlining pay-per-views and dominating highlight reels, Chuck Liddell was just a wild kid from Santa Barbara with a chip on his shoulder and violence in his veins. Born on December 17, 1969, Chuck was raised by a single mother in a house filled with chaos. His father disappeared early, and Chuck, the eldest of four, took on the role of protector. He wasn't raised around money or stability. He was raised around survival. And survival, for Chuck, meant learning how to fight before he even hit puberty. By age 12, he had already begun training in Koei-kan karate, a strict and punishing style that demanded discipline. Chuck wasn't naturally disciplined, but he was addicted to combat. By high school, he was a two-sport athlete, football and wrestling, with a reputation for throwing hands outside the classroom more than inside. At Cal Poly, where he wrestled at the NCAA Division I level, Chuck earned a degree in accounting, but he never used it. His real education came in the gyms and bars of California, where bare-knuckle brawls were as common as lectures. After college, he transitioned into kickboxing and eventually found his way into John Hackleman's famed Pit Gym in San Luis Obispo. That's where the Iceman was born, not just in name, but in demeanor. Chuck didn't talk trash. He didn't scream. He didn't flinch. He walked into fights with a blank stare and left with another man unconscious. His teammates said he was cold as ice before fights and colder after. When the UFC came calling in 1998, Chuck wasn't handed any easy matchups. He debuted at UFC 17, grinding out a decision over Noe Hernandez. From there, he built momentum. Not with hype, but with brutality. The sport was still raw. There were no uniforms, no sponsorship banners, just cages, blood, and chaos. And in that chaos, Chuck thrived. He brought something new to the Octagon, a striking style that defied the basics. His hands were low, his chin was exposed, but his timing? Deadly. He baited opponents in, then dropped them with counterhooks they never saw coming. The Iceman didn't just win, he ended fights with punctuation. But even then, nobody could predict that this quiet killer would become the face of an empire. Chuck wasn't chasing fame, but fame was coming for him anyway. The early 2000s were the Wild West of MMA. The UFC was struggling financially, banned in multiple states, and still viewed by much of the public as human cockfighting. It needed a star, and whether Chuck Liddell knew it or not, he was about to become that star. By smashing through every obstacle in his path, between 2001 and 2004, Chuck went on a violent tear. He outstruck legends like Vitor Belfort and Renato Babalu Sobral with surgical precision. He beat Tito Ortiz in 2004 in a grudge match that became one of the UFC's most watched events at the time. The Iceman's mohawk, icy stare, and trademark walkout to DMX became iconic. He wasn't just fighting, he was building a brand, and fans couldn't get enough. What made Chuck so captivating wasn't just his power, it was the danger he invited. He kept his hands low, defying conventional wisdom, but that was the trap. His timing was predatory, his footwork subtle, and when the opening came, he exploded. One punch, maybe two, and it was over. The crowd would erupt, and Chuck would calmly walk away, expressionless, like it was just another Tuesday. In 2003, Chuck traveled to Japan to fight in Pride against Rampage Jackson, and lost. That fight exposed weaknesses, but also created an even more compelling narrative. Chuck wasn't invincible, he was mortal, beatable, which made his return even more dramatic. Back in the UFC, the promotion leaned hard into building him as a redemption story, and Chuck delivered. He fought Randy Couture at UFC 52 and knocked him out cold in front of a record-setting audience. That night, he claimed the UFC light heavyweight title, and he didn't just defend it, he owned it. Over the next few years, Chuck knocked out Jeremy Horn, Babalu Sobral, and Tito Ortiz again. Each knockout became more iconic than the last. Chuck's fights headlined the UFC's biggest pay-per-views. His face was on billboards. His name was dropped in rap songs. He appeared on Entourage, was a guest on Late Night with Conan O'Brien, and even made appearances in mainstream commercials. He wasn't just an MMA fighter anymore. He was a celebrity. But there's a brutal rule in combat sports. The higher you rise, the farther you fall. And Chuck? He was nearing the top of the mountain, right before the ice beneath him began to crack. At his peak, Chuck Liddell ruled the light heavyweight division like a tyrant. There was no question. He wasn't just winning, he was destroying people. And the UFC, newly reinvigorated under the Zuffa banner, built its marketing engine around him. Chuck was the blueprint. The bald head, the beard, the mohawk, the knockout. He looked like a video game character, and that's exactly what the fans wanted. After knocking out Couture for the belt at UFC 52 in 2005, Chuck went on a reign of terror. He avenged past losses, settled personal feuds, and collected bonuses like candy. His second-round KO of Jeremy Horn was personal. His rematch against Babalu was over in 95 seconds. And then came UFC 66, a rematch with Tito Ortiz that shattered pay-per-view records, pulling over 1.1 million buys. At that point, Chuck Liddell wasn't just a fighter, he was the UFC. But the weight of the spotlight came with cracks. Chuck was now everywhere. Red carpets, parties, club appearances. He was in commercials for beer brands and doing press tours on national television. The Iceman was becoming a pop culture icon, and with that, the hunger that had once driven him began to fade. Behind the scenes, his training camps became looser. His sparring sessions got rougher. There were whispers of him partying too hard, too often. Chuck himself later admitted in interviews that he wasn't always as disciplined as he should have been during those years. But he didn't feel the danger yet. He still had the power, still had the chin, still had the belt, until he didn't. In 2007, at UFC 71, Chuck faced Quinton Rampage Jackson in a long-awaited rematch. And this time, Rampage didn't just beat him, he flatlined him. The image of Chuck lying unconscious on the canvas was shocking. It wasn't just a loss, it was a public undoing. The invincible Iceman had melted. But Chuck didn't walk away. He didn't take a year off. He came back just months later and kept fighting. Because in his mind, the fight wasn't over. Not yet. The myth of Chuck Liddell was built on his granite chin. The idea that he could take your hardest shot, eat it, and come back swinging with something harder. For years, that myth held true. He stood toe-to-toe with brawlers and never blinked. But myths only last so long. And in 2007, that iron jaw finally gave way. The aura shattered. After losing the belt to Rampage Jackson, Chuck returned to face Keith Jardine. It was a bizarre match. Chuck looked off, hesitant. Jardine chopped at his legs and circled away. Chuck lost a split decision. No knockout, no war, just confusion. And that made it worse. The once unstoppable machine was now being outpointed, picked apart. But the real nightmare came at UFC 88 in 2008 when Chuck faced Rashad Evans. For 2 rounds, Chuck stalked him, looking for the big right hand. Then, in a sudden moment of brutality, Evans landed an overhand right so precise, it looked computer-generated. Chuck dropped like a puppet whose strings had been cut, arms stiff, eyes blank. The crowd didn't roar, it gasped. Something had changed. It wasn't just that Chuck got knocked out, it was how he got knocked out. The lights didn't just go out, they vanished instantly. Commentators went quiet. Dana White, who sat cage-side, looked disturbed. The myth of the Iceman had just frozen over. And yet, Chuck didn't stop. A year later, he returned again, this time to face Mauricio Shogun Rua at UFC 97. Chuck landed early, looked sharp for a moment, and then it happened again. Shogun caught him flush. Chuck fell awkwardly into the cage, a heap of limbs and legacy. Another knockout, another haunting image. At this point, Dana White stepped in publicly. "I don't want him to fight anymore," he told reporters. "I care about the guy too much. He's done." But Chuck disagreed. "Fighters fight," he said. "That's what I do." He wasn't just refusing to quit. He was in denial. The knockouts weren't flukes. They were warnings. And everyone around him, fans, doctors, executives, saw it. Everyone except Chuck. Because for him, walking away wasn't an option. Fighting wasn't a job. It was his identity. If he stopped, who was he? Chuck Liddell had always been loyal to the UFC. He never left for pride, never chased bigger paydays in Japan. He stuck with the company when it was bleeding money, and Dana White never forgot it. That loyalty earned him more than just title shots. It earned him a place at the table. And when Chuck's knockouts began to pile up, Dana did something rare in fight sports. He offered a lifeline. In 2010, after the Shogun loss, Dana begged Chuck to retire, not just with words, but with action. He offered him an executive role, vice president of business development, a salary, a desk, respect. It was the closest thing the UFC had to a retirement package. Chuck accepted publicly. For a while, it seemed like he was done. He wore suits to press conferences, appeared at UFC events with a smile. But behind the scenes, something was off. Chuck wasn't built for office life. He didn't want to negotiate deals. He wanted violence. And when you've lived off adrenaline for decades, spreadsheets don't cut it. Friends said Chuck never really left fight mode. He kept training, sparring, posting workout clips. And when he walked through airports, fans still asked, "When are you coming back?" That question, repeated enough, starts to sound like a call to action. There were also whispers of financial pressure. Chuck had made millions in his prime, but fighting didn't come with retirement plans. He lived big, luxury homes, fast cars, Vegas nights, and when the checks stopped, reality crept in. There were reports of failed business ventures, lawsuits, and property disputes. Chuck never confirmed financial trouble, but insiders said it was real. Then came the biggest red flag. Chuck started hinting at a comeback. "If the money's right," he said. "If the timing's right." Dana White was furious. "Number absolutely not. He's done." But Chuck didn't need UFC approval to fight again. There were other promotions and other promoters willing to risk his health for a few headlines. The deeper tragedy? Chuck didn't see the danger, or maybe he did, and just didn't care. To him, retirement felt like death. And fighting, even broken, even old, was still the only thing that made him feel alive. So when Oscar De La Hoya announced Golden Boy MMA, and the main event was Liddell versus Ortiz 3, people weren't shocked, they were heartbroken. Chuck's final UFC fight came in 2010 against Rich Franklin at UFC 115. It was supposed to be a comeback, a statement, proof that he still had one more in him. But what unfolded was the clearest, most devastating evidence yet that the Iceman was no longer built for war. In the opening round, Chuck came out swinging. He threw kicks, landed punches, and looked sharper than he had in years. Commentators began to wonder, was he really back? Could he defy Father Time? But the optimism didn't last. Near the end of the round, Franklin, who had a broken arm at the time, threw a short right hook while retreating. It wasn't a bomb. It wasn't even well balanced, but it landed, and Chuck collapsed. Just like Rashad, just like Shogun. Another knockout, another stiff fall, another empty stare. Dana White was cage-side again. This time, he looked angry. The camera cut away. The crowd fell silent, and the MMA world had finally seen enough. After the fight, Dana didn't mince words. He will never fight in the UFC again. I don't care what he says. It's over. Chuck was released from active competition. His name was retired. His image slowly removed from posters and future title conversations. He had been the face of the sport, and now he was exiled from the very thing he helped build. The Rich Franklin KO wasn't just a loss. It was a full stop, a tragic punctuation mark on a career that should have ended years earlier. But even then, even after that, Chuck Liddell still didn't believe it was over. If Chuck Liddell's UFC exit was a quiet tragedy, his return in 2018 under Golden Boy MMA was a public catastrophe. It wasn't just a bad idea, it was a wake-up call to the entire fight community. Oscar De La Hoya, in a highly publicized move, decided to branch into MMA promotion, and to make a splash, he announced a fight that felt ripped out of 2006. Chuck Liddell vs. Tito Ortiz, Part 3. Only it was 2018. Chuck was 48 years old. He hadn't fought in nearly a decade. His chin was gone, his timing was slower, and he didn't look like the Iceman anymore. He looked like someone trying to cosplay his former self. The promotional press conferences felt off. Chuck slurred his words at times. He stumbled over basic questions. Fans online were split between excitement and concern. Tito Ortiz, for his part, was in much better shape. Younger, active, and fully aware of Chuck's vulnerabilities. He didn't talk trash this time. He didn't need to. Everyone already knew the ending, and it came quickly. The fight took place on November 24, 2018, at the Forum in Inglewood, California. From the opening bell, Chuck looked robotic. His feet were heavy. His stance was stiff. He pawed at Tito with no real speed or threat behind his punches. It was painful to watch, like seeing a hero walk into traffic. Midway through round 1, Tito landed a clean right hand that folded Chuck. It wasn't even a full-power punch, but Chuck dropped instantly. The crowd went quiet. There was no applause, no shock, just a collective sadness. Afterward, the MMA world erupted in criticism. Fighters, journalists, and fans called the fight irresponsible, disgusting, and exploitative. Dana White said it never should have happened. Even Tito, despite his victory, seemed uneasy. "I hope he's okay," he said in the post-fight interview. "I respect him. I always have." Chuck tried to downplay the result. He said he felt fine, said he had fun, but the truth was visible. The way he moved, the way he spoke, the way people looked at him. He wasn't the Iceman anymore. He was a man chasing ghosts and losing to every one of them. Golden Boy MMA never held another event. The promotion vanished, and with it, any hope of Chuck quietly fixing his legacy. That fight wasn't a comeback. It was an obituary. For Chuck Liddell, life after fighting hasn't been a victory lap. It's been a struggle to find purpose in a world that stopped cheering. After the 2018 Tito trilogy, Chuck vanished from the fight scene. No more camps, no more weigh-ins, no more spotlight. Just a man trying to figure out what to do when the only thing he's ever known is gone. He tried staying in the public eye. There were brief appearances on reality TV shows like Celebrity Big Brother. He walked red carpets, posed for nostalgic UFC retrospectives. But every time fans saw him, they noticed the same thing. Chuck was aging fast. He slurred more in interviews. His responses were slower. The fire in his eyes had dimmed. Financially, things weren't much better. Reports surfaced that Chuck was struggling with money. He sold off some property, talked about doing business ventures, but nothing stuck. There were whispers of a cannabis company, some apparel brand ideas, even talks of a podcast, but nothing ever lasted more than a headline. In 2020, Chuck filed for divorce from his wife, Heidi Northcott. They had 2 kids together. The split was quiet, but the timing was telling. Just 2 years after his failed comeback, the personal foundation beneath him began to crumble too. He wasn't training fighters, wasn't working full-time with the UFC. His role as an executive had long been dissolved after Dana White permanently severed that connection. And while Dana still praises Chuck's legacy publicly, it's clear the relationship is strained behind closed doors. Fans started seeing Chuck more often at nostalgic UFC events, but only when invited. There was no steady income, no brand endorsements, no movies. For a man who was once the face of the UFC, Chuck's post-fight career has been defined more by his absence than presence. He's posted Instagram videos, sometimes working out, sometimes promoting charity causes. But there's a loneliness in his social media that fans have picked up on. No gym partners, no coaches, no team, just Chuck in an empty room, shadow boxing the air. He sacrificed his mind, his body, and his legacy for the sport. And now, the sport has no real place for him. stardom. Not as a coach, not as a commentator, not even as a consistent Hall of Fame presence. And that's the tragedy. Chuck Liddell gave everything to MMA, and when the noise stopped, he was left with nothing but silence. Chuck Liddell will always be a legend. You can't talk about MMA history without mentioning his name. He was there when the sport was still in the shadows, before Reebok deals, before ESPN, before it was cool. He helped build the UFC with his fists, his knockouts, and his unshakable presence. But his legacy is complicated. To older fans, Chuck is remembered as the Knockout King, the man who flatlined Tito Ortiz, crumpled Randy Couture, and walked out to DMX with dead eyes and a killer's focus. He was the icon of an era defined by chaos. To younger fans, though, he's the guy who got knocked out too many times, the one who didn't know when to quit, the cautionary tale. And that's the lasting tragedy. Chuck never got his farewell moment. No ceremonial glove drop, no packed arena standing in respect. His retirement wasn't announced with pride. It was forced through silence, first by Dana White, then by knockout after knockout, and finally by the fans who stopped watching. He's not celebrated the way other champions are. Georges St-Pierre retired clean and became a symbol of professionalism. Daniel Cormier entered commentary. Khabib left undefeated and opened a legacy gym. But Chuck's legacy lives on in slow-motion replays and the sad question, why didn't he stop? And that's what hurts most. He was more than a fighter. He was the fighter. And now, in 2025, he lives a quiet life far from the cage. The Iceman name still holds power, but it's power tied to pain. He tried to come back one too many times. He trusted his chin when it was already gone. And when the sport gave him every reason to walk away, he stayed, because fighting was all he had, all he was. Chuck Liddell will forever be a monument in MMA history. But that monument, it's cracked, weathered, and standing alone. Not because he failed, but because he refused to let go.